the wedding that felt like a funeral. The bells of Rome rang as if announcing joy. Yet inside the Vatican, the air felt heavy, funereal, and wrong, as though the stones themselves were holding their breath. Because on this night, a bride was not arriving to be celebrated, but to be consumed by power hidden behind holy walls. And those who understood this truth kept their eyes lowered and their mouths sealed. Lucrezia Borgia moved through the apostolic palace in silence, her silk gown whispering against marble floors polished by centuries of prayers, her face calm only because fear had already exhausted her tears, while behind tapestries and locked corridors guards shifted into place and doors that were never meant to close did so with final, deliberate weight. To the crowds outside, this was a glorious political union, a triumph of alliances and sacred vows. But within the Vatican, the wedding felt like an execution dressed in gold, and the groom, Alfonso d'Este, sensed it the moment he crossed the threshold and realized he was not being welcomed, but trapped. He had heard the rumors, every noble in Italy had, whispers of husbands who vanished, of alliances sealed with blood instead of ink, of a family whose power did not end at armies or assassins, but reached into confessionals and altar rooms. And now he stood at the center of it, surrounded by smiles that carried no warmth. Cardinals in scarlet robes lined the corridors, their faces frozen into practiced devotion, yet their eyes betrayed unease, because they too understood that something had shifted, that this wedding was not meant to be remembered as sacred, but endured as a test of obedience. Above them all presided the Pope, Alexander VI, serene and radiant beneath candlelight, his expression one of celebration. Yet those closest to him sensed the calculation behind every gesture, as if this marriage were a carefully staged performance meant to teach a lesson far larger than two lives bound together. Lucrezia herself was already broken long before the ceremony began, shaped by years of being traded like currency, her past rewritten by men who called it necessity. And as she passed beneath frescoes of saints and angels, she did not look up, because she no longer believed heaven was listening. Servants whispered of strange preparations, of unfamiliar women brought through hidden passages, of instructions delivered in sealed envelopes and burned immediately after reading. And even the master of ceremonies, a man hardened by decades of scandal, felt a chill he could not explain, sensing that this night would surpass every sin he had ever recorded. The ceremony itself unfolded with perfect ritual, vows spoken beneath sacred symbols, voices echoing through chambers meant to represent divine order, yet the words felt hollow, stripped of meaning by the knowledge that the true purpose of this wedding had nothing to do with faith or love. As the final blessing was given, a subtle shift rippled through the room, doors closing, guards tightening their grip on spear and sword. And in that moment, Alfonso understood the truth with devastating clarity. The marriage was only the beginning, the opening act of something darker that would unfold behind sealed doors where no prayers could reach. The feast awaited, the night was young, and beneath the celebration lay a ritual so obscene, so humiliating, that history itself would struggle to carry its weight. And as Lucrezia and Alfonso were led forward together, neither knew that by dawn they would leave the Vatican forever changed, marked by a night the world would try desperately to forget, the feast that demanded silence the moment the banquet doors closed. A silence fell that felt heavier than the stone ceiling above, a silence so unnatural that even the crackle of torches sounded like an intrusion. And in that first breathless instant, every guest sensed the same truth at once. Whatever was about to happen inside this hall was not meant to leave it. The tables glittered with gold plates and overflowing goblets. Music drifted softly from hidden musicians. And yet fear crept between the guests like cold air through a sealed tomb, because guards had taken their positions at every exit. hands resting not in celebration, but readiness. Alfonso sat beside Lucrezia at the high table, his posture rigid, his jaw clenched, already aware that this feast was not hospitality, but surveillance. Every movement observed, every reaction measured, as if the Vatican itself were testing how far obedience could be stretched without breaking. Lucrezia kept her eyes lowered, her hands folded in her lap, her body present while her mind drifted somewhere safer, because she had learned long ago that attention only invited pain. Around them, cardinals forced polite smiles, nobles raised their cups with trembling hands, and no one spoke louder than necessary, for laughter felt dangerous here, and so did honesty. The Pope presided at the center, like a conductor guiding an unseen orchestra, his laughter sharp and untimely, his gaze roaming the hall, as if he were inspecting livestock rather than honored guests. And with every toast he offered, the room tightened, because each word carried an edge, a reminder of past husbands, broken alliances, and the quiet fate of those who disappointed him. Caesar Borgia stood nearby, silent and watchful, his presence alone enough to drain warmth from the room, for he did not need to speak to threaten. His reputation did that for him, and every noble present understood that resistance was not bravery, but suicide. Servants moved quickly, eyes downcast, refilling cups that no one wanted, while whispers spread of preparations taking place elsewhere in the palace, of side doors opening and closing, of unfamiliar footsteps echoing through forbidden corridors. Alfonso noticed the way the doors were checked again and again, how no guest was allowed to wander, how even senior clergy were subtly guided back to their seats if they stood too long. And he realized that the feast was not entertainment, but confinement, a deliberate lesson in power disguised as celebration. Lucrezia felt it too, a pressure building beneath her ribs, the sense of being watched not as a daughter or a bride, but as an object at the center of an experiment. And for the first time she wondered whether this night was meant to punish her, or to warn everyone else. The music grew louder, the wine flowed faster, and faces began to flush, yet the tension only deepened, because indulgence was being used as a tool, dulling senses, softening resistance, preparing the room for something none of them would dare refuse. As the hours passed, Alfonso's dread hardened into certainty. The feast was not ending, it was ripening, and whatever had been arranged behind the walls was waiting for the moment when no one would have the strength or the courage to object. And when the Pope finally rose from his seat, smiling as if unveiling a gift, the room fell so silent that even breath felt forbiddance, because everyone understood that the true purpose of the wedding night was about to reveal itself, and once it did, there would be no turning back. The night the floor learned to crawl, the first sound was not music, nor laughter, but the heavy thud of doors being sealed, a final echo that rolled through the banquet hall like a verdict. And in that instant, every man and woman inside understood. They were no longer guests, but witnesses to something they would never be allowed to describe freely. Torches flared brighter as servants hurried along the walls, their movements sharp and rehearsed, and before anyone could speak, side doors opened and unfamiliar figures stepped into the light, their presence so unexpected that the room seemed to recoil. They were women, dozens of them, draped in fine velvet and silk, their jewelry glittering against bare skin, where fabric had already begun to loosen. And though their faces were carefully painted, fear leaked through the colors in their eyes. A hush spread, thick and suffocating, because no invitation had been announced, no explanation offered, and yet the Pope smiled as if unveiling the most exquisite part of the evening. Alfonso's breath caught in his throat, his body frozen between disbelief and instinct, while Lucrezia's hands tightened until her fingers ached, her gaze fixed ahead as though refusing to acknowledge what her mind was already assembling. With a casual gesture, a command disguised as amusement, The Pope ordered the women to remove their garments, and as silk and velvet slid to the marble floor, the sacred hall transformed into something unrecognizable, a place where reverence dissolved into humiliation beneath painted saints who could not look away. Some cardinals turned their heads, whispering frantic prayers. Others stared in stunned silence, too afraid to move. Because the guards lining the walls had shifted, swords visible now, making it clear that outrage would not be tolerated. The women were instructed to move between the tables, their bare feet cold against the stone, their movements hesitant at first, then forced into rhythm by laughter rising from the highest seat. And the sound of that laughter cut deeper than any blade, because it carried no shame. Alfonso felt nausea rise as he realized this was not chaos but choreography, a ritual designed to strip dignity not only from the women, but from everyone forced to watch, binding them together through shared guilt. Lucrezia's vision blurred, tears slipping silently down her cheeks, as she understood that this spectacle was meant to mark her wedding night, to stain it so deeply that no future memory could ever cleanse it. Then baskets were brought forth, overturned without ceremony, and chestnuts scattered across the polished marble floor, rolling beneath chairs and between feet, their hollow clatter echoing through the hall like mockery. The women were ordered to crawl, to gather them on hands and knees, to compete like animals for rewards promised from the papal vault. And as bodies lowered to the floor, something inside the room broke completely. Cardinals clenched their fists inside their robes, nobles stared straight ahead, servants swallowed sobs, and the marble floor, once walked by emperors and priests, bore the weight of a degradation so complete that even the walls seemed to absorb it. Above it all, the Pope and his son watched, amused, detached, turning a wedding feast into a demonstration of absolute power. And as the women crawled beneath tables and between robes, the unspoken message became clear to everyone present. Holiness offered no protection here. Silence was survival, and the night had only begun to reveal how far it intended to go. The command that broke the night midnight arrived without bells, without prayer, without mercy, announced only by the slow dripping of melted wax and the way every breath in the hall seemed to stop at once, because the laughter had faded and something colder had taken its place. The women were herded aside, trembling and exhausted, the chestnuts crushed into the marble beneath footprints and knees. And for a brief moment, some believed the horror had reached its limit, that the spectacle had ended. That hope died when the Pope rose from his seat. His voice, calm and authoritative, cut through the silence with terrifying clarity, and every head lifted instinctively, because when he spoke like this, refusal was not an option. He reminded the room that a wedding was not complete without proof, that marriage was a sacred duty, and then, with deliberate precision, he ordered that the union be fulfilled immediately, not later, not in private, here, under witness. A collective shock rippled through the hall, so intense it felt like a physical blow. And even those who had endured the earlier degradation now shifted uneasily, realizing the boundary they assumed could never be crossed was about to be shattered. Alfonso felt the blood drain from his face as the command settled into meaning, his hands trembling as he slowly rose, aware that armed guards had already stepped closer, their presence a silent answer to any thought of resistance. Lucrezia remained seated, her body rigid, her eyes fixed on nothing, because somewhere deep within her mind she had already retreated, sensing that survival now meant endurance without protest. The Pope's gaze rested on them both, unwavering, and behind him his son watched with a stillness more frightening than rage, ready to enforce obedience if hesitation appeared. The adjoining chamber was prepared quickly, transformed from a diplomatic room into a mockery of a bridal space, its doors left wide open by deliberate design, denying even the illusion of dignity. Guests were ordered to remain, to bear witness, to understand that this was not intimacy but enforcement, a public seal placed upon flesh and spirit alike. As Alfonso guided Lucrezia forward, their movements slow and mechanical. Whispers of prayer rose from the crowd, broken and desperate, while others stared in silence, too afraid to look away, too ashamed to look directly. Inside the chamber, the air felt suffocating, heavy with incense and fear, and as the ordeal began, time itself seemed to stretch, each moment dragging with unbearable weight. Tears slipped down Lucrezia's face without sound, her wedding gown bunched beneath trembling hands, while Alfonso's breath came shallow and uneven. His mind screaming against a command his body was forced to obey. The witnesses stood frozen, some turning away, others watching in stunned disbelief, all of them marked forever by what they were being made to see. And when the Pope's voice rang out again, demanding that the act be repeated, not once but again, the realization struck with horrifying clarity. This night was not about marriage, but domination, a ritual designed to demonstrate that even the most sacred bond could be bent, broken, and reshaped by absolute power. As the second command echoed through the hall, the truth became unavoidable. Something sacred had already died within those walls, and whatever remained of the night would only deepen the wound that history would later struggle to name. Dawn over the broken and the silent. First pale hint of dawn crept through the high windows like an intruder afraid to be seen, and in that fragile light, the true cost of the night finally revealed itself, because the horror was no longer loud or theatrical. It was quiet, settled, and irreversible. The hall that had echoed with laughter and commands now felt hollow, stripped of movement, as if the walls themselves were exhausted from witnessing what should never have been demanded. Wine lay spilled across tables, chestnuts crushed into dark smears on the marble, and bodies remained frozen in the positions fear had forced upon them, afraid to move even though the worst had already happened. Lucrezia sat motionless, her wedding dress torn and heavy against her skin, her eyes open but distant, as if she were staring at something far beyond the chamber, somewhere unreachable, because the part of her that could feel had withdrawn to survive. Alfonso stood nearby, shaking uncontrollably, his hands clenched as though trying to hold himself together, knowing with sick certainty that no honor, no future title, no alliance could ever erase what had been taken from them both. The Pope watched the room with satisfaction, his authority intact, his lesson delivered, and with chilling calm he issued his final decree, declaring the union sealed beyond question, bound so tightly that no church, no court, no ruler would ever dare undo it. Even those who had convinced themselves they were merely observers now understood the truth. By standing silent, by remaining in the room, they had become accomplices. Cardinals who once spoke of mercy and holiness lowered their eyes, realizing that their silence would follow them to the grave, a burden they could never confess without destroying themselves. Servants slipped away quietly, their faces pale, their hands trembling, knowing they carried memories that would poison their sleep for the rest of their lives. Somewhere near the edge of the hall, the women who had been humiliated earlier sat huddled together, their rewards lying untouched beside them, meaningless in the face of what they had been forced to endure. Their eyes filled not with anger, but with the numbness of people who understood how powerless they truly were. As the sun rose higher, guards relaxed their stance. Doors were finally opened, and the surviving guests were dismissed without ceremony, sent back into Rome carrying a secret that would burn inside them long after the echoes of the night faded. Alfonso left the Vatican soon after, his departure quiet and unannounced, a man hollowed by a single night, carrying a silence that would define the rest of his life. Lucrezia followed him days later, escorted like property rather than a bride, her name already whispered across the city with a mixture of fascination and dread, though no rumor could ever capture the full truth. And somewhere in a small chamber away from the grandeur, one man dipped his quill into ink with trembling hands and began to write, fully aware that what he recorded might never be forgiven, might never even be read, but believing that if the truth was not written down, then the night would win completely. As dawn fully claimed the Vatican, it became clear that the spectacle was over. But its shadow had only just begun to stretch across history, waiting for the moment when silence would finally fail. The truth that refused to stay buried long after the Vatican returned to its rituals and Rome resumed its daily rhythm. The night did not fade, because some events are too heavy for time to erase, and this one clung to history like a stain that refused to wash away. Whispers began first, careful and fragmented, carried through servants' quarters, taverns, and sealed letters written in codes meant to protect the living from the deadliness of truth. Ambassadors sent cautious reports to distant courts, choosing their words with trembling precision, aware that even repeating the story could invite ruin, yet unable to pretend they had not heard what had happened behind sacred walls. Across Italy, noble families read these messages in silence, understanding that the Vatican had crossed a line so severe that fear alone could no longer contain it. The names of those responsible were spoken more quietly than ever, not out of respect, but because people believed power like that could still hear them. Lucrezia disappeared into Ferrara, where she tried to rebuild herself as a duchess, funding art, protecting scholars, surrounding herself with beauty, as if refinement could seal over a wound that never closed. To the public, she appeared composed and dutiful, but those close to her noticed the distance in her eyes, a quiet sorrow that never lifted, as though part of her had been left behind in Rome, trapped forever in that night. Alfonso, once ambitious and proud, became a man of restraint and silence, avoiding courtly excess, refusing to speak of the past, carrying himself like someone who had seen the limits of human cruelty and chosen never to look again. Yet the most dangerous legacy of the night did not live in their lives, but in ink. The master of ceremonies, who had witnessed everything, completed his account in private, his diary a careful, devastating record of events he knew the church would want erased. He understood the risk, that discovery could cost him everything, but he also understood something greater. If no one wrote the truth, then power would rewrite it entirely. For years, the manuscript remained hidden, surviving fires, purges, and deliberate forgetfulness, passed quietly through hands that understood its weight. When fragments of the story finally emerged beyond Rome, they ignited outrage far beyond Italy, fueling sermons, rebellions, and a growing belief that corruption had hollowed the heart of the church. Preachers pointed to the night as proof that holiness had been replaced by spectacle, that authority without restraint would always descend into abuse. And their words found fertile ground in a Europe already restless and angry. Even after the powerful figures at the center of the scandal fell, dying stripped of influence and allies, the damage remained, because institutions outlive individuals, and memory outlives fear. Centuries later, when the diary resurfaced in full, historians recoiled at its clarity, realizing that what had long been dismissed as exaggeration was, if anything, understated. The night of the wedding was no myth, no slander, but a documented descent into moral collapse, preserved by a man who refused to let silence win. And that is why the story endures, not as gossip or legend, but as a warning carved into history itself. It reminds us that the most dangerous rituals are not always hidden in darkness, but performed openly, when power convinces enough people to stay quiet. The past does not sleep. It waits,